Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys today. Talk about this title that was given by Dr. Cesar Corzo on which is towards the best testing protocol to classify a farm as per stable. So we're going to spend the next 25 minutes sharing data and some thoughts to help you classify your own farms based on per stability. So this is a little bit about our group. I had the privilege to work with this group of students working on evaluation of strategies to prevent, detect or manage swine infectious diseases under field conditions. So pretty much all we do is field-based research, mostly on PRRS, and we're going to talk more specifically on the monitoring part, on monitoring tools, population-based tools to monitor sow farms for stability. And as an introduction, the swine industry has increasingly using population-based samples for disease monitoring, not that individual pig sampling and collecting, so individual pig sampling or serum, blood, swab, tonsils, feces, not that that's not important or efficient, but if you look for things like oral fluids or processing fluids, production data, things that measure a population status of disease, and it's just more, it's easier, cheaper, practical, and had a greater herd sensitivity, especially to detect diseases at low prevalence where you would need several, sometimes thousands of samples, individual pig samples, which is cost and time prohibitive in under field conditions. So we're going to talk about the use of processing fluids, also known as nuts and tails, and family oral fluids for testing sow farm stability. There are some other population-based tools that are good for to early identify breaks in naive sow farms or investigate disease circulation in systems thought to be negative, but we are going to focus on this presentation on processing fluids and family fluids. Just here's some data. I'm sure that you guys have your own. This is an example of some 98 herds that achieve stability based on 4 months of testing PRRS PCR on 30 piglets per month, and that, as you know, most people that we talk with have their own examples. Not always that a farm reaches stability using 30 piglets per month. That doesn't always reflect the shedding or the viral circulation in the due to wean piglets. So the next question is, all right, 30 is not enough, so how much is enough? If we go back to this classic table and you focus for a second on the 400 level, which is a population of suckling pigs in a typical farrowing room, if you think about some 40, 36, 40, 38 crates, you would need, that's where your 30 come from. You need some 30 samples to have 95% confidence to detect disease when it's above 10%. As the prevalent decreases, of course, the number of samples that you require increases. You need over 100 samples to detect the virus at 2%, and over 200 samples to detect the virus at 1% level. So not really feasible or not really feasible to work with individual pig samples to detect disease at such a low prevalence. Here another example from Dr. Grant Allison. You see, you have here couple scenarios. The dates are the dates of PRRS testing. Green means that the PCRs were negative. Red means that the PCR were positive. And the question here is, which farm is stable? Well, those are the same farm. The difference is that here in this scenario, you're looking at 30 weaners impulsed by 5. And over here, you're looking at processing fluids, 2 per room, each room with about 16 crates. So you see that by processing fluids, farm was positive for viral circulation, all the way from start to finish here, which indicates that, again, that you need more than 30 samples to detect virus. Virus does have the ability to sustain prevalence under 10%. So the next question is, all right, so how many consecutive negative samples on a processing fluid and testing do I need to gain confidence that virus is not circulating anymore? So if you look at this data from, there's a few collaborators here, Dr. Polyeski, Dr. Will Lopez, Dr. Jose Angulo, in this farm where processing fluids were being collected on a daily basis but then submitted for testing in pools daily pools, testing each week, testing in pools of 4 or 5 days that were processed. So keeping it simple, each week represents pretty much all the piglets that were processed that week. And so you have here CT from PCR for PRRS over time. Here's the cutoff, right, at 37. So any number above this tested positive by PCR, tested negative by PCR. Any number below the line was positive. And the take home from this slide is that 2 or 3 consecutive weeks of processing fluid negative by PCR doesn't mean much in terms of, don't really conclude that the farm is not circulating virus when you have 2 or 3 consecutive tests, right? All right, how about more, 4, 5, 6? Here's a different farm from the same group showing that even 5 or 6 consecutive weeks of processing fluids being tested by PCR, that doesn't really represent at the farm that the virus circulation is gone. The virus may still be there. So you need over 8 weeks. We're going to come back to that number in a little bit. Here's some more data for you from Dr. Allison. 4 farms, same thing here, showing that you have 7, 8 weeks here of negative followed by a positive, and more examples of 3, 4, 5 weeks of negative followed by a positive, being able to sequence those virus, and the conclusion is that, to the best of our knowledge, it's the same virus that has been circulating in those herds. Here's some more results from Dr. Esteban Ramirez from Quequén in Mexico, doing the same thing in a number of farms, testing over time processing fluids by PCR, and he has been observing the same trend as discussed in the previous farm. But one important thing here, different that he's doing, is he has been sampling also 90, sometimes 120 pigs due to win piglets at weaning. And the data shows that even though those PCRs for processing fluids are negative, you not always detect the virus even with 120 samples, which gives an idea that the prevalence is below even 2%, which is the level of detection with 120 samples, indicating again that PRRS does have the ability to sustain infection or circulation, shedding at a very low prevalence. We're talking about 1–2%. All those results were from farms with continuous breeding, continuous farrowing program. This is the only slide I have with the farm dealing with batch farrowing system, with 4 weeks batch farrowing system. Study by Dr. Giovanni Trevisan, showing here that in this system they introduce gilts back in the farms when they reach 2 consecutive batches of processing fluid testing negative, and the median time to achieve that the 2 consecutive negative batches was 28 weeks, with not a lot of variation in that number, suggesting that if you break that flow in the farrowing barn, that may help to shorten or to achieve stability. All those 26 herds did introduce the gilts, and to the best of the knowledge, they remain negative until this point. So it's a batch farrowing system again. So if we go back to the continuous farms, those that I showed you in the plots, and some others that people have been great to share with us, diagnostic information. We built this chart So I think we have over 45 farms here. So the question for what the slide show is that what's the probability of having the subsequent week testing positive by PCR on processing fluids based on what's the number of consecutive weeks that you had testing PCR negative on processing fluids. And so it demonstrates that, again, that 2, 3, 4 weeks of consecutive negative results, you're in the right direction, but don't over-conclude at this point. You really need over 8 weeks to gain confidence that the virus is not circulating at that age of 3 to 5 days, which is the day that you collect that processing fluid sample. Right? So need over 8 weeks. And so the next question is, are those pigs still negative at weaning? And so some more data here from Dr. Allison showing that, well, they may or may not be. Right? Sometimes you have processing fluid, and then if you follow the same cohort of pigs, they're negative. But in a lot of instances here, a lot of rooms that test a negative on processing fluid, they're still positive at weaning. So I'd say that, and some more data showing the same thing, showing that if you test negative on processing fluid, you may or may not be negative at weaning. You have to double check that. So that brings us to another question. Let me just put blank here for a second. Right now, what we are saying here is that processing fluid is it's a very sensitive tool to detect the virus. Simple, straightforward, cheap, and detects the virus, may detect the virus even at 1 or 2 or even lower prevalence. The question is, how about at weaning? So how can you verify that the virus is not circulating at such a low prevalence? And if you want to do that, if you use 30 samples, remember that 30 will only detect virus at 10%, right? 60, 5%, 120, 2%. So you really need to work with hundreds of samples, individual samples. So that's hard, right? You can do that, but that's hard. So that's why we're excited about this part here from Dr. Marcelo Almeida's PhD, looking at oral fluids in the farrowing house. And so later oral fluids, we know that there is a poor reproducibility. It's hard to collect. But with family oral fluids being defined as when you hang the rope where both sow and piglet have access to it, it has a high success rate to collect for some behavioral characteristics. As soon as the baby piglet see mom chewing on the rope, if they're 18 or about 18, 20, 21 days of age, they will copy behavior and contribute to that rope. And here's some more data from Marcelo showing that with up to now, between himself and farm staff that he's been working with, over 700 attempts to collect oral fluids in his studies. That is a 94% success rate, right? So it's been pretty consistent. And so next question is, all right, we can collect that family fluids, but you said that that's from fluid from the sow and the piglet. How does that reflect the viremic status of the piglet? So he went to 72 crates and collected matching family oral fluids and sera from all piglets in the litter. It's not a sample, it's everybody in the litter, and tested everything by PCR on individual, using individual PCR, not pulling anything. So here are results from 3 rooms. And the way to read this is each rectangle is a liter. We have multiple liters in this room. And the blue, if it's blue, it means that the family oral fluid tested negative by PCR. If it's red, the family oral fluid tested positive by PCR. And each little square, box here, little square, represent each piglet in the litter. And the color represents the PCR result of the blood sample of that individual pig. So again, you have liters here with lots of blues, and 1 red means we have 1 single piglet that was viremic in that litter. Right? I'm going to summarize that slide in a little bit, but the last thing I want to say here is that when prevalence is high, virus is everywhere. Pretty easy to find with individual pig serum or with family fluids. Easy to find the virus. As prevalence decreases, you start having just some liters that are positive. When prevalence is low here, you have just a couple or fewer number of crates that are positive, and you may have all the piglets in that litter. You may have just 1 or 2 piglets in that litter that are viremic. So when prevalence is low, you have scattered litters. And so here is one way to summarize those slides. Probability to detect virus in family oral fluids based on number of piglets that were positive in the litter. When there was no viremic piglet in the litter, the oral fluids also tested negative, showing that, supporting our thought that family oral fluid really, you don't need to worry about specificity. So if it detects environmental PRRS that has been hanging around for weeks, that's not going to be frequent, as shown with this data. So when there is 1 or 2 piglets in the litter, 50% chance to detect. If you have litters with 3 or more piglets, we found it all the time in this study. And so Marcelo repeated that 72 matching sets that he used, that I just showed you. He repeated that with some farms at low prevalence. I'm going to show results in a little bit. And he found that, and when he created this correlation of within and between litter prevalence, he found that in situations with low between litter prevalence, you also have low within litter prevalence, and same thing for high. Meaning that if you have just when the prevalence is low, you have just a few crates, 1 or 2 crates that are positive, and within that crate, maybe just 1 or 2 pigs that are positive. So it's really hard to detect that, monitor that using individual pig sample or even population-based sample. Next question is, all right, so how many oral fluid samples do I need, family oral fluids do I need to detect virus in a farrowing room? If it's individual samples, you already know that from that table. You need about 120 to detect at 2%, 200 pigs at 1%. How about family oral fluids? So Marcelo ran this simulation here, working with his own data, and in a farrowing room with 40 crates, if you hang 10 oral fluids, spatially distribute them across the room, and if all of them test negative by PCR, there's a lot of evidence that if virus is circulating, it's going to be under 2%. So 10 oral fluid would match your 120 or so samples. And so what do I do with those to gain confidence that I'm really negative? Before we go there, let me show you couple examples here of case studies that he did. There's a lot of those. I just selected 2 here to tell the story. Here in this farm, what you see here is each box is a week, each column is a farrowing room, and so they has been collecting processing fluids. This first bar here, processing fluids for every room for a number of weeks, and right here at 9 weeks of consecutive negative testing by processing fluids, started doing some family oral fluids and found positive here, 9 weeks, and then 11 weeks after, between all this time you've been testing negative by processing fluids. So showing here evidence of virus circulation at very low prevalence, 1 of 47 crates here and 1 of 43 crates there, with CTs of 30 to 35. So there's the virus. If you look hard, you're going to find it. And so another example here, with just to show that within a week, let's get this week here, and if you look at processing fluid results and then family oral fluid result, virus is there. Maybe in some rooms, not in the other room. So there is, and same thing for family oral fluids, right? You have some positive, some negative, some positive, and so on. So there's this intermittent pattern of PCR detection by week and by room, both in processing fluid and family oral fluid. What's the take home? Sample repetitively over time, and it's a probability game. You may miss this week, but if you sample enough, chances are that you may get it. Last couple slides on herds undergoing elimination. There's near zero prevalence for a long period of time. So you need an aggressive sample size to detect that. or a population-based monitoring, processing fluid and family oral fluid. That's what we're talking about. And there's an intermittent pattern of PCR detection on those samples by time and room or space. So you really need to sample over time. And so, last slide here, that's our sampling thoughts, is use processing fluids as a screening method. And then as soon as you have some 8 weeks of negative result, really need to confirm that with aggressive sampling in the adult wean piglet population, either by individual sample or weekly family oral fluid from all farrowing crates. And we're right now investigating a role of pooling those samples, and would bring in guilds when you have 8 negative weeks of a processing fluid, followed by some 8 or 6 or 8 weeks with confirmed Dutch-Wean negative status. Thank you all these folks who contributed to those results: Drs. Johnson, Robbins, Donovan, Dion, Allison, Ramirez, Yeski, Roto, Schneider, Thomas, Angulo, Jablonski, for data and thoughts, funding, and support and diagnostic testing for PCR and ELISA, and project coordination, graduate students. With that, thank you very much. Looking forward for the discussion at the end of the panel. Thank you.